Race and diplomacy. Brazilian foreign policy between domestic and international politics from colonization to the First Republic. Brazilian history has always stood between two worlds: the internal sphere, marked by slavery and racism, and the external one, shaped by the search for recognition from European powers. Since colonization, Brazilian diplomacy has reflected this tension, trying to balance international pressure to end slavery with the defense of an economy and society built upon it. The concept of color line, developed by Webb Dubois, helps to understand this process. It describes the global division between dominant white people and subordinated non white people, a hierarchy that also shaped how countries like Brazil were perceived in the international arena. Thus, between colonization and the First Republic, Brazil built its diplomatic identity by trying to appear part of the civilized world, even while being a nation deeply marked by slavery and racial inequality. Foreign policy often served as a way to disguise this contradiction, projecting a white and modern image abroad while the country remained internally divided by color and exclusion. The first major impact came from the Haitian Revolution, when enslaved people rebelled and created the first independent black republic in the world. This event terrified the colonial elites in Brazil, who feared a similar uprising. As a result, the Portuguese crown and later the Brazilian Empire intensified the repression of enslaved and black movements. Diplomatically, Brazil sought to distance itself from Haiti, trying to present itself as an orderly and civilized nation connected to Europe rather than Africa. When the Portuguese royal court fled Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and arrived in Brazil in 1808, the colony was suddenly elevated to the center of the Portuguese Empire. This marked the beginning of what historians call the Joanine era. For the first time, Brazil opened its ports to international trade, primarily with Great Britain, which quickly became its most powerful economic and diplomatic partner. British British merchants flooded the Brazilian market, and in exchange for military protection and economic privileges, the Portuguese crown granted the British extensive commercial advantages, including low tariffs and preferential access to trade. This period placed Brazil firmly under British economic and political influence, setting a pattern that would last for decades. However, this growing dependence created a deep contradiction. By 1807, Britain had abolished the transatlantic slave trade and began to pressure its allies, including Portugal, to do the same. But Brazilian wealth depended on enslaved African labor in sugar, coffee, and mining. Diplomatically, this forced the Portuguese monarch to perform a balancing act, outwardly cooperating with Britain to maintain alliances while internally protecting the slave based economy that sustained the empire. Thus, from its very beginning, Brazil's international relations were shaped by a racial and economic paradox, seeking legitimacy and protection from the world's leading anti slavery power while remaining one of the largest slaveholding societies in the world. When Brazil declared independence from Portugal in 1822, its leaders aimed to create a modern nation without changing the racial and social order. The new empire maintained slavery as its foundation, and its diplomacy continued to evolve around Britain, the only major power that could grant international recognition and economic stability. Britain's recognition of Brazilian independence in 1825 came with strings attached. Brazil had to promise to end the transatlantic slave trade. Yet, in practice, the Brazilian government did little to fulfill that promise. The trade did not only continued, but expanded, as plantation owners demanded more enslaved labor to fuel the booming coffee economy. This period defined Brazil's foreign policy as a constant negotiation between moral pressure and economic necessity. On one hand, Britain used anti slavery diplomacy as a tool to expand its influence over Brazilian trade politics. On the other hand, Brazilian elites saw British pressure as an interference in national sovereignty and a threat to their social system. The 1845 Aberdeen Act, which allowed the British Navy to seize slave ships bound for Brazil, pushed these tensions to the limit. Domestically, the Brazilian government faced a growing abolitionist movement, while internationally, it struggled to prevent its reputation as a civilized empire, despite its dependence on slavery. By the time the law of 1850, Eusébio de Queiroz law, finally ended the slave trade, the contradiction between Brazil's international diplomacy and its internal racial reality had become impossible to ignore. The empire's survival depended on maintaining this illusion, appearing modern and progressive abroad while remaining a slave society at home. In 1835, the Malay Rebellion, led by African Muslim enslaved men in Salvador, revealed that Brazil was not isolated from broader networks of black resistance across the Atlantic. The rebels drew on Islamic teachings and African traditions that emphasized community, justice, and freedom, demonstrating a sophisticated political and spiritual consciousness. For the imperial government, however, the uprising was perceived as an existential threat, a potential Haitian contagion that could inspire similar revolts among enslaved populations throughout Brazil. The violent repression that followed, which included executions, deportations, and mass punishments, reinforced institutional racism and intensified fears of social instability. Internationally, it highlighted Brazil's precarious position as a slave-holding society, raising concerns that the nation could be perceived as a black rebel nation and threatening its diplomatic image. During the Paraguayan War, Brazil mobilized thousands of black men, many of whom were still enslaved, to fight on the front lines, often under the promise of eventual manumission. Their involvement exposed the contradictions of the Brazilian Empire. While projecting an image of unity, modernity, and military powers abroad, the nation remained the last major slaveholding power in the Western Hemisphere. Black soldiers' contributions were frequently erased from official accounts, but their courage and resilience strengthened the abolitionist cause at home, turning slavery into both a moral and a diplomatic issue. Moreover, the war experience provided formerly enslaved men with skills, networks, and a sense of agency that reverberated in post-war society, influencing debates about citizenship, racial hierarchy, and the limits of imperial authority. The Land Law of 1850 was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in Brazil history. It declared that all land not previously granted by the Crown would henceforth be considered public property and could not only be acquired through purchase, not occupation. This law had a devastating effect on the country's social and racial landscape. When slavery was eventually abolished, freed people and poor citizens, mostly black, had no legal or financial means to obtain land, forcing them into dependence, informal labor, or migration. The ruling elite used the law to project large states and block social mobility, maintaining the racial class and hierarchy that had defined Brazil since colonial times. Internationally, the land law was presented as a sign of modernization and legal order, aligning Brazil with European property systems. But in reality, it deepened racial and economic inequality. It showed how Brazil's drive for civilization in the eyes of the world often came at expense of its black and poor majority, a pattern that would continue well into the 20th century. When Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, it became the last country in the Americas to do so. The moment was celebrated internationally as a sign of progress, but the end of slavery did not mean the end of racial inequality. Instead, the Brazilian state began to implement policies of whitening, encouraging the mass migration of Europeans and marginalizing Afro Brazilians in labor, politics, and education. This policy was rooted in pseudoscientific ideas of racial improvement and reflected a global belief that whiteness was synonymous with civilization. The government and intellectual elites believed that over time, European immigration would dilute the black population, producing a supposedly superior national race. Diplomatically, these whitening policies were also strategic. Brazil wanted to present itself to the international community, especially to Europe and the United States, as white, modern, and civilized nation, ready to join the ranks of Western powers. This racial project shaped not only domestic policies, but also the way Brazil crafted its global image, one that minimized African heritage while highlighting European culture and ancestry. The Baron of Rio Branco, one of Brazil's most influential diplomats, consolidated national borders and raised the country's prestige abroad. However, his worldview was deeply Eurocentric and racialized. He sought to project Brazil as a peaceful and white power, distinguishing it from the unstable and mixed Hispanic republics. This diplomacy of prestige relied on an European image of civilization, excluding the black and indigenous realities that made up the nation. During World War I, Brazil joined the Allies and sought greater international recognition. The country's elites emphasized a narrative of a widening nation aligned with Western values. Scientific racism and eugenic ideas shaped both domestic policies and Brazil's international image. Foreign policy once again became a stage to perform civilization and whiteness, while the nation remained profoundly unequal and racially divided. By the end of the First Republic, Brazil was still shaped by structural racism and elite control of politics and diplomacy. Abroad, it cultivated the image of a harmonious racial democracy, but in reality, inequality still persisted. Foreign policy continued to seek approval from white powers, while black Brazilians remained excluded from full citizenship. When Getúlio Vargas rose to power in 1930, he inherited a nation still marked by whitening ideology and racial hierarchy, a country trying to appear European from the outside while divided by color on the inside. From colonization to 1930, Brazilian diplomacy was more than a matter of trade or territory. It was also a racial project. The search for prestige and recognition on the world stage was built on alignment with witness and the denial of a black and indigenous contributions. At home, racial inequality structured everyday life. Abroad, the country projected a facade of harmony and civilization. The history of race and diplomacy in Brazil reveals how international politics and domestic hierarchies were deeply intertwined. To understand Brazil's place in the modern world, one must see how its foreign policy was never just about power. It was also about race, image, and the struggle to belong in a world divided by color.